In the frozen ruins of Stalingrad during the winter of 1943, a man wearing the uniform of a Red Army officer barked orders in Russian with a slight accent that occasionally betrayed his origins. His name was Captain Joseph Beyrle, and by the time the siege ended, he would become the only verified American soldier to have fought for both the United States Army and the Soviet Red Army in active combat during World War II. How does an American paratrooper go from jumping behind enemy lines in Normandy to commanding Soviet tank crews in the heart of the Eastern Front? The story begins not in Russia, but in the industrial heartland of Michigan, where Joseph Robert Beyrle was born in 1923 to a working-class family in Muskegon. He grew up during the Depression years, watching his father work at a local foundry, and like many young Americans of his generation, he felt the magnetic pull of duty when war erupted across Europe. In 1942, at age 19, Beyrle enlisted in the United States Army and volunteered for the paratroopers, drawn to the elite status and danger of airborne operations. He trained with the 15th 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, the unit that would later achieve immortality as part of the 101st Airborne Division. By early 1944, he was stationed in England, preparing for an operation so massive and secretive that even seasoned officers spoke of it only in whispers. What made Beyrle stand out among thousands of paratroopers was not just his physical capability, but his aptitude for languages and demolitions. The Army recognized his talents and assigned him specialized training in sabotage techniques. He learned to blow railway lines, disable communications equipment, and operate behind enemy lines for extended periods. These skills would save his life more than once in the months ahead, though not in ways his instructors could have anticipated. If you're watching this because you want to understand not just what happened in the past, but why individual choices mattered in the machinery of the Second World War, consider subscribing. This channel exists to bring you the mechanics of Soviet and Cold War history through stories that textbooks often miss, and there's much more to uncover. On the night of June 5, 1944, Beyrle boarded a C-47 transport aircraft with his stick of paratroopers. The invasion of Normandy was hours away. His mission was to parachute into occupied France ahead of the beach landings and destroy a key railroad bridge near the town of Carentan, disrupting German reinforcements rushing to the coast. The weather was terrible. Low clouds and anti-aircraft fire shredded the formation. Beyrle jumped into darkness at around 1 in the morning on June 6th, but his parachute deployment was rough, and he landed hard in a swamp far from his designated drop zone. Within hours, separated from his unit and moving through hostile territory, he encountered a German patrol. A brief firefight erupted. Beyrle was captured. The next 7 months would turn his life into a surreal odyssey through the underbelly of the Third Reich's prison system. He was sent first to a holding camp near the front, then transferred deeper into occupied territory as the Allies pushed inland. The Germans classified him as a saboteur because of the demolitions equipment found on him, which placed him in a more dangerous category than ordinary prisoners of war. By late summer of 1944, Beyrle found himself on a cattle car heading east towards Stalag 12A, near Limburg, a camp notorious for overcrowding and disease. He would not stay there long. Within weeks, he was moved again, this time to a labor camp attached to a factory complex in eastern Germany, where prisoners were forced to work in munitions production. Beyrle quickly realized that accepting his fate meant slow death from malnutrition, abuse, or an Allied bombing raid on the very factories where prisoners labored. He decided to escape. His first attempt came in late August. He managed to slip away from a work detail, but was recaptured within 2 days, half-starved and hiding in a barn. The punishment was severe: solitary confinement, reduced rations, and a transfer to a higher security facility. But the experience taught him something crucial. The German rear areas were chaotic, filled with refugees, forced laborers from a dozen nations, and demoralized troops. If he could blend in and keep moving east, he might find a way through the lines. He tried again in October. This time he made it farther, stealing civilian clothes and moving at night, but a checkpoint near the Polish border ended his run. Another beating, another transfer. By the end of 1944, Beyrle had attempted to escape 7 times. Most prisoners gave up after 1 or 2 failures. The odds were impossibly stacked against success: guard dogs, informants, the brutal winter, the lack of food or maps. Yet each failure refined his understanding of the system. He learned which guards could be bribed, which routes were less watched, and how to exploit the confusion created by the Soviet advance from the east. In January 1945, the war entered its final, most savage phase. The Red Army launched a massive winter offensive across Poland, smashing through German defensive lines and driving west with a speed that shocked both Berlin and the Western Allies. The front was collapsing. Prisoner camps in the path of the Soviet advance were hastily evacuated, and thousands of POWs were force-marched westward in freezing conditions, an episode that would become known as the Death Marches. Beyrle was among them. Columns of starving men shuffled through snow and ice, guards shooting anyone who fell behind. It was during one of these chaotic marches, near the town of Grafenrode in central Germany, that Beyrle saw his chance. On a night in mid-January, amid the confusion of an air raid, he slipped away into the forest. This time, he did not head west toward the distant Allied lines. He turned east toward the sound of artillery. The logic was counterintuitive but calculated. The closer he got to the Soviet advance, the thinner German security would be and the greater the chance of reaching friendly forces. For days, he moved through frozen woodlands and abandoned villages, scavenging food from cellars and avoiding both German patrols and desperate refugees. The cold was merciless. His feet were wrapped in rags. He had no weapon, but he kept moving. Then, on a grey morning in late January, he stumbled into a forward position of the Soviet First Ukrainian Front near the town of Polda. Red Army soldiers surrounded him, rifles raised. Beyrle raised his hands and shouted the only Russian words he knew, cobbled together from a phrasebook he had memorized during his captivity. Ya Amerikanets, Tovarish, American. The soldiers were skeptical. An emaciated man in tattered clothes, speaking broken Russian, claiming to be an American paratrooper deep inside Germany. It sounded like a German trick or the delusion of a desperate prisoner. They took him to their commander. What happened next would have seemed impossible in any other context, but the Eastern Front in early 1945 was a place where the normal rules had disintegrated. The Soviet officer who interrogated Beyrle was a woman, a major in the NKVD attached to a tank brigade. Her name has been lost to history, but her decision was not. After hours of questioning, examining Beyrle's dog tags, his paratrooper boots, and his knowledge of American military structure, she brought him to the brigade's commander, a colonel who had studied some English before the war. Beyrle explained his story, the jump into Normandy, the capture, the escapes, the march, and his decision to reach Soviet lines. The colonel faced a dilemma. He could send Beyrle to the rear for processing, which would take weeks and likely result in the American being stuck in a bureaucratic limbo, or he could take a risk. The colonel chose the risk. He needed every able body, and the front was moving fast. Beyrle, despite his condition, had combat training and demolitions expertise. More importantly, he had something intangible, an almost reckless determination that the colonel recognized. After consultation with the brigade's political officer, Beyrle was issued a Soviet uniform, a submachine gun, and a place in a T-34 tank crew. Within 48 hours of reaching Soviet lines, Joseph Beyrle was fighting again, this time under the Red Banner. For the next several weeks, Beyrle served with the Soviet Tank Brigade as it pushed westward through Poland and into Germany. He later described the experience as both exhilarating and terrifying. The Red Army's tactics were brutal and direct, massed armor attacks, little concern for casualties, and a speed of advance that left supply lines stretched thin. Beyrle operated as part of the tank infantry, the troops who rode on the outside of the T-34s and dismounted to clear obstacles and enemy positions. The work was deadly. German Panzerfausts and hidden anti-tank guns turned every village into a potential ambush. Soviet losses were staggering, but the momentum never stopped. Beyrle's role was primarily in reconnaissance and demolitions. His experience with explosives made him valuable for clearing roadblocks and destroying enemy fortifications. He communicated with his Soviet comrades through a mix of broken Russian, hand signals, and shared combat instinct. Language barriers dissolved under fire. He ate the same rations, black bread, thin soup, occasional canned meat, and slept in the same frozen ditches. The ideological gulf between American capitalism and Soviet communism, so vast in theory, meant nothing in the mud and blood of the front. Survival was the only ideology that mattered. In late February or early March, the exact date is unclear from surviving records, Beyrle's luck ran out again. During an assault on a fortified German position, his tank was hit by anti-tank fire. The explosion killed 2 crew members instantly and severely wounded Beyrle with shrapnel to his legs and back. Soviet medics pulled him from the wreckage and evacuated him to a field hospital. His war was over, but even in a hospital bed, his strange journey was not finished. As Beyrle recovered, Soviet authorities began the slow process of verifying his identity and repatriating him. The problem was that no official channels existed for an American soldier who had fought with Soviet forces. The United States military had listed Beyrle as missing in action, then killed in action after his capture in Normandy. His parents in Michigan had received a telegram in late 1944 informing them of his presumed death. Meanwhile, Soviet officials were hesitant to simply hand over a soldier who had fought in their ranks without proper documentation and approval from higher command. The absurdity of the situation was compounded by the growing tension between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies, a friction that would soon harden into the Cold War. Beyrole's case eventually reached the desk of Marshal Georgy Zhukov, one of the Soviet Union's most celebrated commanders. Zhukov was in Berlin in the spring of 1945, overseeing the final destruction of the Third Reich. When informed of the American paratrooper who had fought with Soviet tank crews, Zhukov reportedly found the story remarkable enough to warrant personal intervention. He ordered that Beyrle be brought to his headquarters. The meeting was brief. Zhukov, through an interpreter, asked Beyrle why he had chosen to fight with the Red Army. Beyrle's answer was simple. He wanted to kill Nazis and go home. Zhukov respected that clarity. He arranged for Beyrle to be escorted to the American lines with official Soviet documentation praising his service. In April 1945, Joseph Beyrle crossed into American-held territory in Germany. The soldiers who processed him were stunned. Here was a man officially declared dead, arriving from Soviet lines, wearing a mix of Soviet and American uniform pieces, carrying papers signed by a Red Army marshal. Military intelligence officers debriefed him extensively. Some were suspicious, wondering if he had been turned into a Soviet asset. Others were simply baffled by the sheer improbability of his story. But Beyrole's dog tags, his detailed knowledge of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, and the testimony of other repatriated PAOs who had known him in the camps gradually confirmed his identity. The United States Army sent Beyrle home to Michigan in May 1945. His arrival was a shock to his family, who had mourned him for months. Local newspapers ran stories about the paratrooper who had died and come back, who had fought for both armies against the Germans. But in the immediate post-war years, Beyrole's story did not receive wide attention. The beginning of the Cold War made any tale of American-Soviet cooperation politically awkward. The narrative of wartime alliance was quickly being replaced by mutual suspicion and hostility. Beyrle himself was not inclined toward publicity. He had survived something extraordinary, and he wanted to move on with his life. He married, started a family, and worked for decades in the telecommunications industry in Illinois. For nearly 40 years, he rarely spoke publicly about his experiences. The military awarded him the Purple Heart for his wounds in Normandy, but there was no official recognition of his service with the Red Army. The Soviet government, for its part, had no clear procedure for honoring a foreign national who had fought in its ranks under such unusual circumstances. Beyrole's war existed in a kind of bureaucratic and historical limbo. That changed in the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Researchers combing through newly opened Russian military archives found references to an American paratrooper attached to a tank brigade in early 1945. The story resurfaced. Beyrle, now in his late 60s, was invited to Russia to receive formal recognition. In 1996, he traveled to Moscow and met with Russian veterans and officials. He was presented with medals, including the Order of the Red Star and the Order of the Patriotic War. The Russian government acknowledged what the Soviet bureaucracy had never formalized, that Joseph Beyrle had fought as a Red Army soldier and earned his place in their history. The trip to Russia was deeply emotional for Beyrle. He reunited with surviving members of the tank brigade and visited memorials to the war. He spoke at schools and veteran gatherings, emphasizing not ideology, but shared sacrifice. In interviews during this period, he was careful to frame his service with the Soviets not as a political choice, but as a soldier's pragmatic decision in extraordinary circumstances. He had not fought for communism. He had fought against fascism and for his own survival and freedom. The distinction mattered to him, especially in the context of American Cold War memory. Beyrole's story gained wider attention in the United States in the early 2000s. Historians working on accounts of D-Day and the prisoner of war experience began to highlight his case as unique in the annals of World War II. Veterans organizations invited him to speak. He became a fixture at commemorations of the Normandy landings and appeared in several documentaries about the 101st Airborne. In 2002, he published a memoir with the help of a co-author detailing his escapes, his time with the Red Army, and his post-war life. The book sold modestly but earned critical respect for its straightforward, unsentimental tone. Joseph Beyrle died in 2004 at the age of 81. His funeral in Oregon, Illinois was attended by veterans, Russian diplomats, and representatives of the American military. He was buried with full honors. On his gravestone, alongside his American military service, is an acknowledgement of his time with the Red Army, a rare epitaph that bridges two worlds that spent half a century locked in existential rivalry. The broader significance of Beyrle's story lies not in its uniqueness alone, but in what it reveals about the nature of war, identity, and the choices individuals make when institutions fail them. The Second World War produced millions of stories of dislocation, survival, and improvisation, but few encapsulate the fluidity of that conflict's final year as vividly as Beyrle's journey from American paratrooper to Soviet tank infantryman. His decision to fight with the Red Army was not born of ideological conversion or betrayal, but of the cold calculus of a soldier trapped behind enemy lines who saw an opportunity and took it. It also underscores the degree to which the political narratives of the Cold War obscured the messy human reality of the alliance that defeated Nazi Germany. Beyrle fought alongside Soviet soldiers who were, in that moment, allies of the United States, even if that alliance was already fracturing. His story complicates the simplified binaries that dominated post-war memory: East versus West, democracy versus totalitarianism. In the frozen forests and burning villages of eastern Germany in early 1945, those categories mattered less than the shared objective of destroying the Third Reich. Moreover, Beyrle's repeated escapes and his refusal to accept captivity speak to a kind of individual agency that persisted even within the total warfare of the 20th century. The prison camps, the forced marches, the surveillance, and the violence were designed to strip prisoners of will and identity. Most men, understandably, could not sustain resistance, but Beyrle's 7 escape attempts, each one a gamble with his life, represent a stubborn insistence on self-determination that bureaucracies and barbed wire could not fully suppress. His later recognition by both American and Russian governments, decades after the events, also illustrates the long, slow process by which history gets revised and complicated. The Cold War required clear narratives. Heroes could not be too ambiguous. Beyrle's dual service did not fit neatly into those narratives, so it was minimized or ignored. Only after the ideological contest ended could the full story be told and honored without political discomfort. In that sense, Beyrle's posthumous fame is itself a Cold War artifact, a truth that had to wait for the thaw. Today, his story is taught in some military history courses as an example of adaptability and resilience under extreme conditions. It appears in discussions of unconventional warfare, prisoner of war psychology, and the complexities of the Allied coalition. But perhaps its most enduring lesson is simpler and more human, that in the chaos of war, people make choices based on survival, loyalty, and the desire to continue fighting for something larger than themselves, even when the institutions meant to protect them have abandoned them to fate. Joseph Beyrle jumped into the night over Normandy as one kind of soldier and emerged from the war as another, shaped by capture, escape, and an alliance born not in a treaty room, but in the wreckage of a collapsing empire. His war was not the one planners envisioned, but it was the one he fought, and in the end, that is the only history that truly matters.